Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Latin America. Good morning, Europe. My name is Ernesto Montero. I will be moderating this session. Just a logistics note before we start. Please note that even if the session will be held mainly in Spanish, we will have also interventions in English and Portuguese. Hence, we have simultaneous translation that you can access through the Zoom toolbar on the lower right side.
My name is Ernesto Monter, and I will be moderating this session. And before we begin, please note that the session will be conducted mainly in Spanish, and although there will be presentations in English and in Portuguese. So we're offering simultaneous translation, which you can access in your screen on right down corner. And with this, I would say that la División de Transporte del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo,
that the Division of Transport of the IADB and the ITF from the Organization for the Cooperation of Economic Development, OECD, are pleased to have you participate of this event to present the results of the initiative Support for the Planning of Low Carbon Transport Systems in Latin America and the Caribbean. This event has been divided in three parts, basically. We will start with an opening message with the representatives of the IADB and ITF, followed by a general presentation by the ITF staff, and they will tell us about the main findings and recommendations for each of the cities that have been studied. Finally, we will hold a high-level panel with representatives of the secretaries of transport of the cities of Buenos Aires, Bogotá, and Mexico City, as well as two guests from cities of Curitiba and Montevideo. Without further ado, I will now invite Mr. Nestor Roa, head of the division of the Inter-American Development Bank, to say his welcoming words. The floor is yours, Nestor. Thank you, Ernesto, and everyone. It's a pleasure to be sharing this event with you all and to share also the results of the joint work that we have been doing and we will be discussing throughout these days. I wanted to especially greet Yang Tai Kim, our Secretary General from ITF, and other colleagues from ITF, and Jose Menendez, Head of Transport of the City of Buenos Aires, the Head of Transport of the City of Bogotá, Rodrigo Diaz, Mobility Secretary of the City of Mexico, Cristina Waldmanson, a consultant in financing and public investment in the Research and Planning, Urban Planning Institute of Curitiba, and our colleagues from the AADB and others. Welcome, as I was saying, to this first day of a series of webinars that we will be holding throughout the week, which will focus in the dissemination of the results of the regional initiative for decarbonization of urban transport in Latin America. This initiative is the result of a very narrow cooperation between AADB and ITF. And it is done within the framework of the program Decarbonising Transport, which promotes urban mobility, which is carbon neutral, to mitigate the effects of climate change. 4 years ago, it seems only yesterday when we started this initiative, the context for the reduction of greenhouse emissions in the world, well, we were generating the first contributions at national levels. NBC, because of its acronym in English, right? At the time, the countries and cities were in the process of translating their NBCs into projects and specific actions for which it was necessary to have the tools that were quantitative and that allowed us to establish which were the transport policies that would be more effective to reduce emissions. Today, the need of this type of tools is even more relevant in the context of the pandemic and post-pandemic, which will add to the context of climate change and the climate emergency. And it's crucial to increase the generation of NDCs. If we analyze the NDCs in the region, we the exception of some English-speaking countries in the Caribbean, most of the countries do not have specific targets for emission reductions in transport. At the same time, when we look at the details of the mitigation strategies, it is evident the ambition and its limitations regarding the sector. Only 38% of the countries in Latin America had included specific actions in their mitigation plans, whereas in the adaptation, the strategy is reduced to half of the countries. On the other side, from the approach of the paradigm of changing or improving, avoid, shift, improve, we see that 57% of the mitigation actions are to promote cleaner fuels and to modernize the fleet of transport. Usually, they are under the scope of improving. 38% refers to improvements of public transport, mainly as investments in mass transportation. On the other hand, the participation of actions to minimize traveling is minimum, such as actions and practices to have an impact to the peak in increase of automobile travel that will continue as we have seen during the pandemic. Today, in the COVID context, all these actions to promote these flexible times of work, telework times, and relocalizations that seemed impossible before are a variety for certain parts of the population and for certain types of jobs. Today, we have the possibility to establish a roadmap to reach our targets globally. The challenge is to profit from the current contingency to attend to failures in the market that exist, to improve the quality of the reporting services, and the main goal, which is to reduce emissions. For this, public policies need to take a new role, balancing regulations and incentives to the markets that interact in a continuous, precise way. From IADB, we reaffirm our commitment to work hand in hand with you and to contribute and drive the planning and application of urban transport systems that are low in carbon emissions. I hope that the tools that we have developed throughout these 3 years that we have cooperated in the workshops and the virtual meetings and the feedback of databases and exchange of experiences contribute to strengthen the strategic planning of mobility and transportation. I would also like to thank the commitment and the many hours of work of the different teams of the mobility secretaries and environment secretaries. Your participation was crucial to consolidate this initiative. On the other side, to the teams of the ITF and the IADB, thank you for the effort invested and to have such good results. Without a doubt, these tools are quintessential to prioritize the mitigation measures regarding greenhouse emissions and to continue with our environmental commitment. From its origin, this initiative by ITF wanted to promote collective actions and cooperation among cities in the region, more specifically Buenos Aires, Bogotá, and the City of Mexico, to generate quantitative evidence for the most effective measures to decarbonize urban transport. So I am very pleased to see the evolution of this dialogue platform and the exchange of knowledge where conversations go beyond CO2 emissions and air quality. They also expanded to other crucial challenges in our sector, such as informality, subsidizing transport, or gender equality. In the next few hours, we will be sharing the results of this cooperation with you and discussing the opportunities and barriers to move forward to low carbon transport systems at the same time that we contribute meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. We hope these discussions can contribute to strengthen the collaboration mechanisms for institutions in the sector and to consolidate the cooperations with multilateral banks and other international bodies and organizations that work in transport and climate change. Without further ado, thank you very much and a great success for you in this day. Thank you, Nestor. And following, Mr. Young Tai Kim, Secretary General of the ITF.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Buenas tardes a todos. Welcome everyone. Thank you also from my side for joining this final event of our Decarbonización de Transporte en Ciudades de América Latina. As many of you will know, decarbonizing transport has become one of the 5 focus areas of the International Transport Forum. ITF's Decarbonizing Transport initiative was launched in 2016 after the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. In this initiative, the ITF, together with more than 70 partners, is helping governments and industry transform their climate ambitions into actions. One of our partners since the very beginning has been the Inter-American Development Bank. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the IDB and especially Nestor Roa for their continuous support and collaboration on this initiative and beyond. Our collaboration with IDB has already led to several successful projects addressing accessibility, or like the DTLA project, Decarbonization Concerns of Latin American Cities. We hope to be able to make a difference with you, and thanks to you, also in the future. And there will be many more opportunities to work with each other. I also want to thank the city administrations who have been working with us on this project. The purpose of this project is, of course, to support you in developing your decarbonization policies, but without your very active engagement, the project would not have been effective. I hear the collaboration with all of you has been particularly rewarding. All cities were highly motivated to contribute to this project and invested time, be it through the sharing of information and data or the participation in the various events that took place in the course of this project. This is what has made this project a great success so far. We sincerely hope that what the IDB and the ITF can provide as inputs of this project, thanks to the collaboration with you, will be of great use for your administrations in the long term. My colleagues will provide insights into these outputs and project findings shortly. Now allow me to put this project and the theme of decarbonizing transport in Latin American cities into the broader climate change context. The world has committed to pursuing efforts to limit the increase in global average temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The role of the cities and the role of transport in cities is highly important in this context. ITF estimates provided in the upcoming ITF Transport Outlook 2021 show that around 1/4 of transport CO2 emissions stem from cities. In Latin American cities by 2050, passenger transport demand is likely to more than triple, and freight transport demand is likely to double. These values lie significantly above the global averages. The challenge is very clear. Transport emissions must not grow at a similar rate. In Latin American cities, as all cities around the globe, must ensure that their transport demand growth can be decoupled from CO2 emission growth, and ideally, that these growth scenarios can be revised downwards overall. The DTLA project provides an assessment of the specific challenges of Latin American cities in this context. It provides decision makers with information and quantitative tools that will support the right decision making going forward. Again, we hope the work provided will be of use for you, the authorities of the case study cities of this project, but also far beyond. Once again, I, on behalf of my team, sincerely thank all the project stakeholders, including the colleagues at the IDB, for their great collaboration all along this project. I'm looking forward to the discussions by all panelists this week and thank all participants for their interest and time. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Secretary General. And we will continue in English for the next part. And ITF will present us an overview of the decarbonization initiative and the principal outputs and results for the 3 cities involved. And before giving the word to ITF, I would like to introduce probably the key participants from ITF. ITF had an important team behind this effort, including Stephen Perkins, Joshua, etc. But I'm going to present the 2 key individuals that have led this initiative. And I would start with Elizabeth Winship. Elizabeth leads the policy analysis team at the ITF in Paris and manages the Decarbonization Transport in Latin America Cities project. Elizabeth focuses mainly on work streams of ITF Decarbonization Transport Initiative and oversees projects focusing on transport decarbonization pathways for the European Union, Latin America, and emerging economies. Prior to joining ITF, Elizabeth worked in the private consulting sector, focusing on transport policy assessments for the European Commission. The second key individual on this effort is Dimitrios Papaionou. Dimitrios is a transport modeler, and he's currently working on the developing of ITF urban and non-urban passenger models, which estimate and forecast transport demand, model shares, and greenhouse emissions, and therefore potential decarbonization pathways. Dimitrios has also worked as a research associate in Project Drawdown, which is an alliance of scientists, researchers, and other stakeholders whose aim is to combat climate change by modeling the effect of existing strategies regarding how to reduce greenhouse emissions and proposing promising new strategies. Dimitrios holds a master's in civil engineering and has a PhD degree in transportation systems. And with this, I should like the word for Dimitrios and Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. So I will start off with giving you now a bit of a more concrete view of the project and the context and objective first. Then Dimitrios will give you a brief overview of the models that we have actually developed for this project before we can then start with the panel discussion with the secretaries of mobility of our 3 case study cities and beyond. So many of you will know that Bogotá, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City have been pursuing policies for equitable and sustainable transport already for a while. Many of you will also know that the IDB's regional public goods program provides support for the planning of low carbon transport systems. And as our Secretary General just mentioned, there is the ITF Decarbonizing Transport initiative that promotes carbon neutral mobility. So you can see that all the stakeholders that we brought together in this project are basically pulling on the same string, and we all want to make sure that we achieve carbon neutral mobility by 2050 or soon after. And this project hopefully contributes to this. Before I start going into the project itself, a few words about ITF's Decarbonizing Transport initiative. And I do not want to repeat what our Secretary General has already said. I just want to say that there are some key enablers, some key pillars that allow us to work on decarbonizing transport. First of all is obviously the funders, among which is very thankfully the IDB. There are many project partners with whom we work continuously on all our different projects to gather the knowledge, the expertise around the globe, basically to contribute to this project. And very importantly, there's also the so-called ITF modeling framework. So the ITF has built up modeling capacity in-house over the past 5 or maybe 10 years. And this modeling capacity helps us in many ways to actually deliver those projects and to continue with this aim that we actually want to provide quantitative evidence to cities, national governments, regions, and so on, to help them define the policy strategies and mitigation actions that actually will help in achieving the climate ambitions. There are several work streams on the Decarbonizing Transport initiative. I only want to highlight this one blue one here, which is the pathway development, which is exactly one where our project fits in. So basically, this work stream, in this work stream, we want to help countries, regions, metropolitan areas to define pathways to meet the transport CO2 reduction ambitions. And this was exactly also the purpose of this project and the aim we have been working towards all along. So now a bit to our Decarbonizing Transport in Latin American Cities project. More specifically, the objectives were to help reduce CO2 reduction emissions by assessing current policies and existing challenges in each of the cities, developing and providing a quantitative transport scenario assessment tool for each of the cities as well, and with the help of these tools, design scenarios that can help inform policymakers on the impact of different measures, on measures they have maybe already planned or that they may be considering for future policy action. And a second broad objective was that the project aims to provide a platform for peer learning and best practice exchange among the project cities and beyond. And for doing so, we brought together the stakeholders of this project, not only in its final event, but also already before. So now more specifically to the very concrete outputs that these projects has let us produce. So first of all, there's a policy report which addresses the current policies and existing challenges in all of the cities. There are 3 transport CO2 assessment tools. So basically there was one tool developed for each city, and this was accompanied by user manuals, by methodological notes, and so on, and was handed over or is currently being handed over to our respective city counterparts. There is a scenario report which has been fully drafted and provided for review to the cities, and which is also one of the main reports that feeds into this webinar, a series of webinars for which we are here today, because we will be presenting many of the results that we have fleshed out more specifically in the scenario report. And to bring all the stakeholders together, well, there were 3 in-person workshops in 2019 when this was still feasible, one in each of the project cities. In between, there were many technical trainings and bilateral calls and follow-ups in order to make sure that the transport assessment tools are actually up to scratch and are meeting the requirements from the cities. And there is now obviously the final event where we once again bring all the stakeholders together to make sure there is actually this exchange across cities and beyond. Here, a quick timeline of the project. I do not want to go into this in detail, just to let you know that we started in 2019. We are now at the final event. And the items to finalize at this point in time is that we are still in the process of handing over our quantitative tools. More specifically, one city is missing where we are still doing this. The others have been covered already. And the final reports need to be published. These will be joint IDB and ITF publications. So watch the space in terms of the IDB news channels and ITF news channels to be aware when these project reports actually come out, which should be later this year. Then for the modeling tool, I will hand the floor briefly to my colleague Demetrius, who has been the driving force and the main person working on developing these models all throughout this project. Demetrius, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. So just some very brief information on the modeling tool that we used to quantitatively evaluate the decarbonization pathways for the cities. So first of all, just to talk about, we used data from various input sources. Here we just list a few, which are the main information that we used. We had information from surveys, from the mobility models in the cities. We also have a lot of data that we use from our in-house ITF databases and from our global models. And then, of course, we combine this with an exhaustive literature review in trying to understand the impact of different policy measures. Of course, the model itself also is a tool, so it works with inputs from the user, which measures are selected, when, and so on. We'll look a bit more later on in a second. So methodologically, the model works as a strategic scenario assessment tool. So it's a strategic model. It follows the principles of the 4-step transport model, the classic 4-step transport model, but it does leave out the 4th step of traffic assignment. So it takes into account the different flows within the city and the different modes, and then it produces the outputs. The outputs, as you can see on the right, are transport activity data and emissions. So trips, passenger kilometers, vehicle kilometers, CO2 emissions, pollutant emissions. So as this tool is it details the city, it splits the city down to more than 30 zones. Each city has more than 30 zones where these flows are estimated and results are produced for each of these flows in the city. And of course, they are then aggregated up and provide some visualizations for the users to do. Just one last thing about this model. This model, in order to be easy to use, it was created in Excel. Obviously, some of the modeling was done outside of Excel, but everything was incorporated in the final tool so that the users, the cities, can use this and update it over time. Now, next slide, please. Thank you. Now, this is just a screenshot from the tool itself. So this is the scenario builder. This is the Excel sheet where the user would select which policy measures to implement and when. So obviously, here you just see that the top part of it, there is a lot more policies. The model, the tool allows a direct comparison of two scenarios. So the user would select what they would like to test in either and then produce the results. And on the right, you see an example of the zone system that we use for Buenos Aires. We had similar zoning system for the other two cities. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to give a brief overview of the main policies that were included. There are some additional policies, but they were sometimes more specific. But overall, they can be categorized in different groups. One could be the type of measure, for example, as you can see on the left, regulatory instruments, pricing instruments, or as you can see on the right-hand side, the level of impact, whether something is implemented across the entire zone, the entire city, sorry, whether it's implemented in a specific zone or whether this happens in an OD pair. And some of the measures were more general. For example, here you see the next, the enhancement of infrastructure, that tends to be more specific. If you're creating a new public transport line that works between two zones, it does not work over the city as a whole. Whereas if you do something such as integrated ticketing, that applies for the entire city. I would like to mention one thing, that it is hard to estimate the direct impact of a comprehensive impact of the impact of each measure, because obviously the impact would depend on which zone it is, when it is put in place, which zone it is put in place, and what is the intensity of it. But a methodology note with some information on this has been shared with the cities, where they can understand the relative importance of its measure. And one last category of measures that we have included that are listed at the bottom here is clean vehicle uptake. We did not have explicit measures for the clean vehicles, but rather a target, either a sales target or a fleet target at a certain year. Thank you very much. I think now the floor goes back to Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you, Dimitrios. And I will give you an overview of some of the key findings. First of all, I want to, in a very high level nature, summarize the findings of our policy report, where we analyzed what the challenges are that cities actually face and what are especially the similar challenges that they face in the pursuit of a sustainable transport system. So most importantly, all three cities face significant transport demand growth over the coming decades, and has already faced such a demand growth in the past years. And this has been putting increasing pressure on the transport systems that they have to cope with. Also, in all three cities, public transport provides really the majority of mobility for people. However, these public transport systems need upgrades typically. Either this means in terms of their geographic coverage, their reach to different income levels of the different groups of population, or also in terms of maintenance requirements that have been unmet or are being unmet at the time being. Also, There is increasing incomes across these cities, and this drives individual motorized mobility, either in terms of the uptake of two-wheelers or four-wheelers, but obviously both of them are not ideal in terms of driving, hopefully, CO2 emissions reductions. Then, as already briefly mentioned, or suggested at least, funding for public services is insufficient, and therefore also there is a lack of funding that goes into making sure that public transport is actually serving the needs, and especially serving the needs going forward when there will be this ever-increasing pressure on the transport system. Then there's also a certain issue in all three cities with regards to the alignment of policies across the different jurisdictions. So obviously we are talking here about very big metropolitan areas that go well beyond the boundaries of the specific cities. And we have seen in some case study examples that policies are sometimes not only not well aligned, but some policies even backfire basically, because they have been introduced in one jurisdiction, but not the other. And there is really therefore this missing alignment across the whole metropolitan areas. And then another issue is urban freight, and the fact that urban freight movements are not necessarily well understood for the time being. There is a lack of data collection and a lack of knowledge, or not knowledge, and lack of capacity of that to know what would actually be the best levers to make sure there can be emissions reductions also in the urban freight sector. So many of these issues are obviously not specific to the three Latin American cities that we analyzed in this study, but many cities will recognize these issues, also many European, North American, Asian cities. So I think really many of these issues are quite global issues for large metropolitan areas around the world. Now we have, for the purpose of the scenario report and for the purpose of having some degree of comparison of the different cities, we have let all three cities define what we call a baseline scenario. But I have to make you aware that each city had their own definitions of the baseline scenario. So this is not necessarily directly comparable to each other, because some cities were more let's say, optimistic in terms of what policy plans they can actually implement, especially now after the pandemic. And some city authorities were a bit more pessimistic in terms of what will actually be feasible. But I think there is a certain degree of alignment that all three cities basically said, okay, let's be this baseline scenario, a scenario where certain policies that are already being planned will actually be happening in the time frame to 2030 at least. And then also quite similar across all three cities, you could see that many of them were quite wary to define any policy measures beyond 2030 in the baseline scenario, because that was simply not clearly defined yet in any existing policy plans. And what we see in these baseline scenarios is that cities, thankfully, so to say, will decouple transport activity from CO2 growth with heavy reliance on clean vehicles, however. And well, the first part of the message is very positive, meaning that there will be this coupling of transport activity from CO2 growth. This is in line of what should be happening. You can see that there will even be a decrease in CO2 emissions from transport in these baseline scenarios. However, the more like not so positive point maybe is that there is a very heavy reliance on these ambitions to be met thanks to the uptake of clean vehicles. This is not a problem in the CO2 emission perspective, but since we are talking about developing fully sustainable transport systems that are equitable, accessible, and where also congestion issues need to be resolved, obviously this heavy reliance on clean vehicles will not cover all these issues, so to say. So in these scenarios, noticeable shifts away from the use of private vehicles to more sustainable modes are not yet really achieved. Similarly, we have then asked city authorities to define a bit more ambitious scenarios. Simply, let's call them here what-if scenarios, because each city, again, actually defines their own definition of what this what-if scenario and the alternative policy scenarios should actually be. And some people here went all out, so to say, throwing in all policy measures, just testing what would be the outcome, where versus other cities were maybe a bit more cautious again, and just testing on a more cautious note of what they think could maybe be possible also in the 2050 timeframe. You can see here that cities do actually come close to international climate commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement, and a lot of the emissions can be reduced. There is also transport demand reductions that stem from further intensification of teleworking trends and land use measures that are assumed here in these scenarios. However, there is again a big reliance, obviously, let's say, on the clean vehicle uptake. However, in these scenarios, you can already see some more shifts that can be observed, and this points to achieving the development of more holistically sustainable transport systems overall, which is very positive. Now, some recommendations again, which can apply to all the 3 case study cities, but again, very likely also beyond the 3 case study cities to many other cities in Latin America and potentially around the globe. We would suggest that cities should strive to implement land use measures that contribute to limit transport activity growth as quickly as possible. We know that land use measures will take time, so basically policy measures should act on them quickly to make sure that the impacts and the positive impacts will actually materialize as soon as possible. Policymakers should indeed follow through on the uptake targets of clean vehicles, because these will be the comparatively quick wins, and meeting intermediate targets in the 2030 timeframe, for example, will necessarily be heavily reliant on the uptake of such vehicles. However, in the long term, please do not rely on the uptake of such vehicles alone. It bears also many risks, meaning there may, for example, be supply issues. Some policy measures may not be as fruitful as you think, and it would then be good to not have put all your cards basically on one, well, sorry, it was a strange meaning, not bet only on one option. An alternative could also be to support transport innovations. We are, as the International Transport Forum, we are always encouraging the shift to shared services. So shared mobility should really be taken up. This can be supported by lots of digitalization efforts, where the use of shared services will become more and more easy for the transport users, and they should therefore be more willing to take up such alternatives. The pandemic provides an opportunity to build back better, and you should make use of, let's say, the momentum. It's not only to build back better from the transport authority side, but also each individual has now basically the opportunity to move from exceptions to sustainable new routines. And the role here from the policymaker should be to communicate that this is now the time to rethink mobility behavior, to reassess what people have been doing, to hopefully change them for the better. And also, last but not least, cities should be developing long-term strategies. We have noted that some of the cities have only policy plans in place to 2030 and do not seem to think even further to the future. And we do hope that our ITF tools that we have provided in the context of this project will be of great help here to develop also such long-term strategies. And obviously this was very brief and very high level. I do hope that the project reports, when they come out, will be of interest, and they will obviously provide many more insights regarding the findings for each specific city, but also the sessions in the coming days will provide many more specific insights and recommendations. So we do hope that many of the audience here today will also tune in the coming days to have a bit more insights on what we found for the specific cities. And with this, just a concluding remark also from my side, a big thank you to all the project team from the ITF side that has contributed to this project, and foremost to Dimitrios, who has just given you a brief overview of the model, who has done really the bulk of this work on this project in terms of providing all these modeling tools and authoring the scenario report, obviously supported by Joshua, Stephen, and Asuka. And you will hear and see more of these colleagues in the coming days, also in the city sessions, when on the other hand, you will see much less of myself. Also a big thank you to the IDB and to the cities who have really made this project very interesting and have allowed us to work with you on this. It was also for me and personally a very enriching experience to submerge in Latin American city transport policies and challenges that you're all facing. And I do hope that we get the opportunity again to work with each other very soon. So thank you. This is it from me. I hand the word back to Ernesto, who will then, I think, start with the panel discussion. Thank you.
Gracias, Elizabeth. Gracias, Dimitrios, por todo este contexto.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Demetrius, for all this context and for telling us the main findings of the project. I also wanted to highlight the great cooperation that we had with the cities and the flexibility that ITF had to adapt and tighten the model for the specific situations of each city. I think that nobody saw 3 years ago when we started this initiative the pandemic. Of course, nobody could anticipate the pandemic, but we did not only adapt to working in the pandemic context, but also we consider scenarios resulting from the pandemic. And as Elizabeth said, it's an opportunity to do different things. With no further ado, we will now move to the third part of this event, which is a high-level panel with decision makers in mobility in cities of Latin America. For this panel, we have the honor of having the presence of secretaries and undersecretaries of the case study cities, and we have guests from 2 other cities, as we were saying. Curitiba has been invited, and Montevideo as well. So before we start, I wanted to introduce them very briefly, all of our panelists, starting with Juan José Méndez. Juan José is the Secretary of Transport in the city of Buenos Aires. He is an economist, and he has taken different roles in the public sector, mainly in the Secretary of Transportation. On the side of Colombia, we have Nicolás Estupiñán, who is the Secretary of Mobility of Bogotá. He's a civil engineer by the University of Los Andes, and he holds a master's by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has been working in the public sector, in the World Bank, and in the IADB as well. He is very committed to every aspect of mobility, and now especially decarbonization as Secretary of Mobility for Bogotá. From Mexico City, we have Rodrigo Diaz. He is the Undersecretary of Planning, Policies and Regulation of the Secretary of Mobility of the City of Mexico. Rodrigo is an architect, and he has a master's in urban planning from the IMIT. Rodrigo has vast experience in the public and private sectors. In Chile, he was the director of the infrastructure department of the urban area government, and he has held different positions in Mexico. He worked for CTS VAT in Mexico and in IDEA. He is a pedestrian by conviction, and you can regularly find him doing different marks on his walks. As the panelists of the cities that were not part of the initiative, we have Ana Cristina Waldman-Zurnich. She is an architect and urban planner, and she has over 20 years of experience developing projects for the city of Curitiba. She has been deeply involved in different types of organizations and networks, including the group of electromobility of the Ministry of Development of the Regional Development, where she sees initiatives for mobility, energy, and others. Finally, we also have the honor of having Pablo Infamuso, who is the General Director of the Mobility Department for Montevideo. Pablo has also been Director of the National Road Safety Unit, and he has held different positions in the sector of mobility and road safety. With no further ado, I will now ask secretaries and representatives of the different cities, maybe starting by Juan José, to share 5 minutes of their opinion about the findings. Where do you see the trends going in the cities? And some kind of conclusion as well. We would consider 5 minutes per participant. And then we are going to open the floor for specific questions. Juan José, you have the word. Thank you very much, Ernesto. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, obviously, to Nestor, to Jan King, all the ITF team. It's impressive, all the work that you have done and the conclusions that Elizabeth and Dimitrios have presented. about what we were able to do cooperating among the three cities, but mainly with your support. It's a huge pleasure also to share with my peers of wonderful Latin American cities who have always been a source of inspiration for Buenos Aires. Let me see. Well, first, and I think it's a conclusion that we all have drawn from the last times, is the pandemic was a disruption. We were discussing technology was the disruption and everything was changing through technology. We suddenly had this pandemic that altered everything that we were doing in the cities. And I think that in terms of mobility, and a perspective towards the future respect the use of the soil of public space and the relationship with public space, it accelerated many of the processes that we were implementing before. So one of our first conclusions was that we understood that the way out of the pandemic could not have higher environmental costs, despite we saw an increase, a peak of the use of cars, this based off the fear that appeared through the linking of public transport and infection with COVID-19. In that context, and a bit also as a conclusion of the analysis of the study that we did along the ITF and the IADB, I believe that what became evident is that it is possible to have a decarbonization strategy aiming at 2050, and that the strategy does not only include a technological shift, but it must also be accompanied by changes of habits of citizens and changes of habits that I was just saying we have been encouraging and uh, also profiting from the way out of the pandemic. For example, promoting changes in the use of soil or public space in the mid and long term, adapting to this new reality of telework, remote work, of the development of the local life, the life in the neighborhoods, which we discussed before. Suddenly, in the city of Buenos Aires, in the last 12 months, we have seen an impressive transformation in the neighborhoods. And how are we going to sustain that through time, knowing that it's giving us the opportunity to develop things locally, trade and businesses, but with less mobility and less emissions, to develop trade and education and other situations that historically were connected to more traveling and more emissions. So I think that now there we have one of the most important challenges. And finally, and to wrap up my 5 minutes, I also think that another one of the learnings and thinking about decarbonization heading towards 2050, there is no possible way out without a collective work. And when I mean collective work, I mean collective work among different cities, collective work with organizations such as ITF and IADB, with a myriad of NGOs that also are involved in this line of work, who promote associativity, and that we could also learn together. The changes have happened so fast that the possibility to share with our peers the learnings and the lessons and the pilot tests, and that we had to scale them up immediately for the whole of the city, I think that this was crucial. And looking forward, those learnings have to be very present, and insofar as we can consolidate these working networks, we will be getting closer to reaching our goal. So I am very thankful for this space, for this project, and the support that you have given us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Juan Jose. And it's very encouraging to hear that it is possible to have a decarbonization strategy aiming at 2050 and including the new reality with all these metrics. We all have to take this into account. I think that with no further ado, I will now give the floor to Nicolas Estupiñán. He is in Bogotá. Nicolas, the floor is yours. Thank you, Ernesto. And I also would like to say good morning and afternoon for everyone. It looks like a friends gathering, so I'm very pleased to be able to share all these aspects of work with you. The question posed is very important regarding how we can have a long-term model for decarbonization aiming at 2050, and also understanding the uncertainties that we have in the future, As Juanjo said, it is true that the pandemic accelerated certain transformations that were developing already. All of the cities were developing these transformations. We were redistributing the use of public space, trying to find efficiency and balance of equitativity in the use of public space, but the pandemic created havoc in this, and I think it posed the question of how are we going to work in the planning of the use of public spaces and planning transport, because from multilateral banks, think tanks, and NGOs, for many years we have been thinking about this, but we have not managed to do this, to really articulate that planning of the use of public space with transport, largely due because of the fact that the cities are completely consolidated, they are very dense, and to generate new centralities and generated 15-minute or 30-minute cities within the levels of consolidations of this metropolis is virtually impossible. But the pandemic has taught us, nevertheless, that in the future, where we have to start planning transport, we have opportunities that we have seen emerge in the cities, and the way to consolidate a model of occupation of the territory is not now related to the width of the avenue, but to the width of the broadband. So that is going to condition us looking at the future and to see how we will be able to access the different opportunities that will emerge in the cities. One of the conclusions that Elizabeth introduced about the results of the studies, that is that demand of growth from the cities. Well, I don't know if it's going to be like that. We have seen that our cities, and we have discussed this, we have a group in which we discuss these issues a lot with Rodrigo, with Montevideo, with Ana Cristina is not there, but we have to include her. And this is about the impacts that we have had in terms of taxes and finances for service supplies. We have to provide a service guaranteeing the social distancing, but we also see the impacts of the incomes of the system. So we don't know if the demand is going to grow. We all have a series of bidding processes open and projects that are underway that we, with support of IADB, are developing our green runway on one of the most emblematic areas of the city. It's the dearest street of Bogota. And we also have one problem that we have been introducing here. It's really useful. We don't know how to estimate with a certain degree of certainty those improvements in infrastructure for pedestrians and bicycles, and how are they going to reflect in a modal change. So what we do here during the pandemic, we went to have 16% of trips in 2019 to have 60% of trips in bicycles. So we don't know how stable that percentage is going to be. And we know that during the pandemic and right now, people prefer individual transportation modes. We are all doing efforts to have unmotorized individual traveling modes, but we do not know how to estimate the best infrastructure that we're planning. For instance, this green runway on the 7th Avenue, we don't know, and we have not managed to find precise estimates that allow us to know how much we can expect of the modal transfer. This is a very important work, and it's very important to be able to understand that vision of decarbonization for 2050. How much can we expect? How much can we try to estimate the modal transfers from using engines to more sustainable modes? And how could we then have an articulation with the uses of soil, probably with a lot of support of the virtual sphere, and also then have an infrastructure to have very high quality bicycles that can capture more demand. So this, I believe, is very important to be able to consolidate this type of projects as the green runway of the 7th. And that would be useful to replicate these models in other runways in other cities, and especially adding a component that was very difficult, which is the cargo component. We have had not much progress, to be honest. Cargo is, or freights are uh, difficult at the regulation level, at the national level, with more complicated political actors. And from the cities, I think that this is an actor that we have not properly included, and we have not managed to seduce these type of transportations to more sustainable technologies. So insofar as we have tools for this work that we have seen here, we will have more ways to generate evidence to be able to contribute in that process of conversion. I will stop here now. Thank you so much for these thoughts, Nicolas, and we can be witness to everything that you're doing in Bogota, in the Green Runway, all the different initiatives that you have there. We took note and to see how we can estimate and this infrastructure and how we can change the uses of transportation and the modes of transportation. I will now give the word to Rodrigo Diaz from the City of Mexico and the Secretary of Mobility. Rodrigo, the floor is yours. Hello, good morning, good afternoon for those of you in Europe. We might have some sound problems. I'm open doors in the Chapultepec forest. You can look at the wonderful landscape behind me. Continuing with this friend gathering, as Nicolas said, and reinforcing many of the concepts that Juanjo and Pablo also, or Nicolas also said, the workshops that we had in 2019 were very different to what happened during the pandemic. It has been a true catastrophe in the world of mobility for good and for bad, and that has to be reflected as well in our considerations. I believe that the first, but not the most important one, is that something fundamental is that always in the decarbonization processes, we had given a great importance to the change of modes, of transportation modes, that is. But nonetheless, I think that we have to start from a common base. In Latin America, usually, we already have very good distribution of transportation modes. In the case of the city of Mexico, 1/3 of motorized trips are done with cars, which is very good. To improve that is very, very difficult. So I think that we have to make an effort to sustain that. Nonetheless, there is another component that we had minimized before, which nonetheless we can see how the best way to move forward is managing demand and especially telework. Telework or remote work has decreased remarkably the number of trips, and it has allowed us to change the rush hours. We have different rush hours, which allows us to distribute the trips better, which means less traffic on one side and less crowded traveling, let's say, in public transport, which also allows us for better operations. Remote work with the potential of penetrating in cities such as Mexico City, and I think it's the same situation for Bogota or Buenos Aires, of around 35% of the jobs, 1/3 of the work can be done remotely or in a flexible way, which gives us a very broad margin to maneuver. And I think that's where we can move forward the most in this subject. This is not the universal remedy, of course. This is not the universal solution and can have disastrous consequences socially. So we have to balance this remote work, because we have also seen that it leads to fatigue, depression, and impoverishment socially. So that is remarkable. So we will have to move to policies that can strike a balance between on-site work that enriches communications with remote work that from the side of mobility is very good and also enriches the lives in the neighborhoods. We can also take profit from the boom of bicycles, and this is the time to risk to build more infrastructure where we had not thought about. And I think that the three cities have been along this path. We have to give better ease to use this, because this is a moment that we have to profit. We cannot let this go. If we had financing problems for public transport, of course, the decrease in demand is starting to be like an elephant in the room that is very big, and we have to analyze our public transport system because we don't know exactly when they will recover their demand and how they will recover their demand and how that demand will act in the future, how it will behave in the future. So this is something that we have to look into, analyze, and it makes it very difficult for us to move forward. At the same time, another of the subjects is not only the decrease of demand, as we have a negative economic impact on all activities, as the cargo or freight sector. We have sectors that are very depressed, that cannot do or cannot change their fleet, or they cannot invest in green technologies that could make their operations cheaper, but whose capital costs are very, very high. So we are going to have a transition period, and the introduction of technology will have to be delayed a couple of years precisely because of the stagnation of economic activity. We will have to assume that, and we will have to assume that delay that might be compensated with less traveling. So it's ticked for that. I think that this tool is very valuable, and it clearly can give us the possibility to see where we're headed towards the future, and something that the report says very quickly: how can we have quick wins that break the inertia? And I will leave it here now.
Gracias, Rodrigo. Creo que efectivamente el tema de
Thank
la
you,
pandemia.
Rodrigo. I think that the pandemic is something that is a recurring issue and has been a recurring issue in the last year. I think that none of us actually thought that we would be teleworking for more than a year, and all these changes, you've mentioned them already, they mean that these are challenges and opportunities, and we need to try to find a balance between these opportunities and these challenges. I think that now we would like to hear two people who were not part of the initiative, but who have heard about the context provided by the ITF with regards to this initiative, the main findings and recommendations. And I would like to listen to the representatives from Curitiba and Montevideo, whether that is consistent to what they are doing in their cities, whether it's different or not. And like with the previous participants, you have 5 minutes.
Bom dia, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Agradeço aqui o convite e a oportunidade de poder compartilhar com vocês um pouco o que Curitiba tem feito para descarbonizar o transporte e principalmente trocar experiências. Acho que os achados que vocês trouxeram, eles fazem muito sentido para mim, à medida que eu for abordando alguns aspectos.
It makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about these aspects. Curitiba is the capital of the state of Paraná, the southern part of Brazil. This is a city that has almost 2 million inhabitants, and it's a hub city in a metropolitan region that has almost 3.5 million inhabitants. Curitiba has many interactions that we need to solve. Curitiba became famous due to their transport integrated urbanization process. This was an inspiration for the bus rapid transit concept that is so enforced nowadays, or familiar nowadays. The concern with climate change and its impact was considered in our planning process in 2019 when we arranged and created a climate change forum. Since then, it has grown. In 2011, we were part of the C40 city network. My colleague from Buenos Aires mentioned this. And we had technical and methodological support that made it possible for us in last year to conclude with our climate action plan in order to be carbon neutral towards 2050. The plan preparation dealt with or had different support instruments like the inventory of GHG, CO2 emissions, and the build and the construction of CO2 emissions scenarios in the city, we need to consider that the transport sector accounts for almost 67% of all emissions in the city. I generally emphasize that speaking about urban mobility is not just a matter of choice, it's a need, a necessity if we want to have an effective solution towards 2050 when it comes to decarbonization. Mobility needs to be considered as an asset in the city. While building these emission reduction scenarios, we use the pathways tool that was prepared by the C40, and we used 3 mitigation premises in the transport sector. We not only work with vehicle technology and fuel technology, but also we dealt with the increase in mass transportation and reduction of transport done via individual vehicles. We analyzed 4 scenarios. We worked at business as usual. There was a disruptive, ambitious planning. In the disruptive scenario, we almost reached our carbon reduction goal, a reduction of 38%, and we believe that 85% of displacements and movements can be done by a collective transport, and only 7% of individual vehicle transport are about 46% at the moment, and 100% of passengers could be eventually driven by a renewable energy. We know that there are barriers, financial, political, social, structural limitations, and technological limitations as well, which in the short term, it is unfeasible to have strategies considered and conceived for that reduction. We have huge challenges. So what have we done to face these challenges? We created an alliance network, and we set up different technical cooperations to help think about these challenges and to develop the necessary competencies. We have partnerships with the IADB. We would also like to thank them because they are great allies with the C40, with the AFD, with the World Resource Institute, with the MIT Cooperation Agency, with the government of Switzerland, ministries of economy, local ministries of economies, as well as certain local alliances. With these network, we designed a strategic map whose greatest objective is to reorganize and rethink the logic behind the Curitiba's urban mobility transport system so that it's more attractive for people. And it's important to mention that in the last year, we lost 30% of passengers in the collective transport system. With the pandemics, we lost 70% of passengers. We try to achieve greater energy efficiency in transport. So how do we combine these areas to achieve carbon neutrality? We're working in four actually important fronts. We want to decarbonize the collective transport fleet to attract clients and customers to collective transport, promote active mobility, and to have a strategy that is innovative to support this process. The strategy also has important cooperation with the IADB so that we can have more information and better data to rethink the system. We also have 2 strategic transport projects ongoing. We're talking about lines that are part of our transport mode of transportation that carry 37% of our passengers. We are expected to invest $247 million in the next 5 years between different funds if we want to have both projects working 100% clean. Elizabeth mentioned this, and we want to use these projects to inspire our city and to make this passage and transition possible. We're working on a model to welcome these new modules that are not considered in this investment. We have thought about a new business model. And to wrap up, we have a great window of opportunity for 2025 once the current Curitiba's collective transport concession finishes, and we may be able to suggest a new model and try to find a way to combine and integrate assets and resources of more urban mobility, whether it's ride shares or whether we can then decarbonize the fleet and use those tools so that we can avoid at most individual vehicles, so that our collective transport fleet is more attractive, so that they can leave their cars at home and they can become a part of this integrated holistic mobility, so thus we can reduce CO2 emissions. I think that quickly this was briefly what I wanted to say, and once again I would like to thank everyone for the opportunity of me being here and sharing experiences with you all. Thank you. Thank you. We definitely believe that Curitiba is within the plan. You're getting ready for this and you have identified the challenges, which is extremely important. Before I ask a final round of questions for everyone, I would like to hear Pablo and your reactions in terms of what ITF means and perhaps if it's similar to what Montevideo has been doing. Pablo, you have the floor.
Bueno, sí, buenos días, buenas tardes.
Good morning, good evening. It is an honor for me to be part of this panel, and having listened to the previous speakers, I feel quite relieved now, more than before, because I fully agree with what mostly Juan Jose, Rodrigo, and Nicolás have said. In the case of Curitiba, well, of course, we know what that city means to all of us, but if we think about how this is affecting us, this pandemic is affecting us, I think everything has been said already. I will not repeat it, but considering what has been suggested, we had been carrying specific pilot experiences in terms of electromobility. We had been pushing or trying to push the use of bikes. Although the pandemic has had positive effects in terms of the bicycle, in terms of public transport, it has honestly affected us in terms of the transit. The pandemic has deeply hurt us, and I think that the concerns and uncertainties that we have in terms of public transportation system, well, we will have to wait some time to see what the new normality will look like. I heard Elizabeth and her comments, and that made me think about more about the politics rather than the technical aspects of this. Elizabeth talked about how important it was to think in the long term, to be able to plan in the long term. And well, nobody actually was planning in the long term for the pandemic. And we never thought about how the pandemic has repositioned cars, vehicles. We had this cultural battle saying that it was not a war against vehicles or cars, but we were trying to have our people understand that cars make cities unfeasible. So we had been trying to raise awareness about this, and the pandemic then really hit us hard, not only in terms of economic, financial aspects of transport systems, but also culturally speaking, this individual mode of transportation that we somehow had wanted to beat. But I think that we will have to wait for many years so that people can go back to trusting the public transport system. We had been gravely hit and hurt by the pandemic. And if we talk about humanity and the world and politics, I cannot but say that, unfortunately, I have to be very pessimistic when it comes to the world governance. each of us is thinking how we can govern our cities, our countries, but the world does not, for example, make it possible to have an assured and a guaranteed supply of vaccines in the midst of a pandemic. And this perhaps might be a more political statement or thought. But if we're talking about multilateral entities like the IADB, who are struggling and making huge efforts to go towards one goal as a planet, then how much further can we insist on the fact that in this rich, developed world, they have not been able to guarantee the third world or the poor world a vaccine? So we need or have to still think about this from the political standpoint. And things that we're talking about today, carbon emissions, electromobility, all those great things for the world, we need to consider them politically. We need to think about 2050.
Que el mundo tenga un gobierno, ¿no? Y que tenga líneas también el mundo al 2050.
So that we can make sure that there is a world on 2050. If not, if we don't do that, today we have a pandemic, tomorrow we might have a government change in certain countries. And deep down, what I wanted to say is how important politics are with what we're saying. And I've run out of my 5 minutes, but I wanted to tell you what we're doing in Montevideo. We'll be very brief.
Tenemos 63 taxis eléctricos.
We have 63 electrical taxis in a fleet of 3,000 taxis and 31 battery cars in a fleet of 1,500. We have many barriers to overcome, and I'm sure that you will be able to assist us to move forward in this process. We are convinced that this is the way to go. Uruguay has a power policy or an energy policy that is almost 100% based on clean renewable power and energies. We have great energy reserves at night, and we have many advantages that without a doubt must help us bring down those barriers. I think one of the most important ones nowadays is that we have a subsidy to fossil fuels, and it really complicates things in public transport. I think that's one of the main barriers. And I think another one that probably you experience as well is the lack of trust from operators. We're proposing this change and they don't trust us. There's many uncertainties, increasingly less, but still, I do think that ITF and IADB will need to convince us. So thank you again for this invitation. Thank you, Pablo. And thank you for this political reflection and considerations, because it might actually lead to the quick final question, a minute each for the panel members. And what are the international level support or actions that would help in your city to ensure that the actions needed for 2050 can actually become a reality? In 1 minute, could you tell us what actions from the international community would be useful for you? Then, Nicolas, you have the camera on, so could you tell us in 1 minute what you think this could do? I think it's a great question, Ernesto. And hopefully some of the answers will help me complement mine. Without a doubt, one of the most important things that we can have help with is with funding of these sustainable transformation projects. That is essential for us. We have many emblematic projects that not necessarily have the whole status quo support when it comes to the series of actors that we have, traditional actors. And I think that international organizations have that stamp of approval or seal of approval or guarantee that technical support like ITF or the IADB. And that gives us citizens the peace of mind that these transformations are heavily supported. You've been through this. The transformation of in the different cities that we have tried are not easy. Charles Atkin says it in his Street Fight book. If you push status quo to one side, status quo kicks you back stronger, right? So these transformations that we have carried out, well, they need the support and the funding from multilateral entities. That seal of approval, that seal of transparency, that technical excellence seal is what pushes or lets us push that status quo. And having your support is essential.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. What could you share in 1 minute? Well, I fully agree with what Nicolas said regarding the financing. Financing is not only because of what it implies for our cities and Latin American economies to have financial support, which is so necessary, but also because of that trademark, that guarantee that we have in the transformation project that we have, and something that we mentioned throughout our presentations or that came up in a couple of opportunities, as Anna also said regarding Curitiba, is that possibility to exchange among peers and to promote the exchange between peers for, in many cases, to have certain actors that can be invited to get to know. I mean, we're pretty much integrated with at the level of policymakers and sharing experiences, but we don't always have our operators seeing the operations of the operators in Curitiba or Bogotá or vice versa, to also be able to transfer models for contracts, for exploitation, and many situations that in the past, when we implemented the VRTs in Buenos Aires, it was crucial to have the chance of our operators to travel and to be able to share the experience of other cities abroad that encouraged them to accompany the transformation process that we were encouraging. But in this second generation of transformations that we are aiming at now, that implies technological changes and large investments, of course, financial support is crucial. Thank you, Juan Jose. I don't know, we have only 1 or 2 minutes. Rodrigo, I don't know if you're around there. Maybe we have lost Rodrigo in the forest of Chapultepec. It's an ideal situation. No, no, you haven't lost me yet. No, no, I'm here. Rodrigo, in 1 minute or maybe 45 seconds, which would be the kind of actions at the international level that could help Mexico City to meet its goals of decarbonization for 2050? Well, I think that the summary made by Juanjo and Nicolás is very clear. Clearly, on one side, we have the issue of financing, of course, and also the issue of sharing and assessing experiences that are very specific for a city and for each of the cities and the region. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, the possibilities of traveling have reduced and communication is easier but also impoverished because you share online, and to have the possibility to have the direct contact firsthand, and not only the great decision makers, but also, as Juanjo said, the operators, the technicians in very specific areas, as could be some very specific technologies that could really help, and the possibility to have more informal contacts. We do have that with Buenos Aires and Bogota. We have a chat, but that type of possibilities really, really helps. Perfect. Thank you, Rodrigo. And Ana, Pablo, if something has not been said yet by Nicolas or Rodrigo, you could now share what kind of support you would need from the international community. Well, you said, Pablo, some of these things during your comments, but if it's something you wanted to add, yes, I just wanted to say a phrase. I think that it would be very helpful, especially for IADB, to align actors, especially within our countries, third, second, and third level of government. When we have political changes, I think that to align the different actors, of course, you think of your own place of work, your own country, but I think it would be very useful to align actors inside countries. Perfect. Thank you very much, Pablo. I don't know, Anna, if you have anything to add. No, I think everything has been said. As a long term, that support, that advocacy to guarantee the continuity of actions is paramount, and to organize governance. Those are issues that you can really contribute at our local level. Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you, Anna. And I think that we could all stay here chatting for a long time. We are all fascinated with mobility and transport, but unfortunately we ran out of time. But also, as Nicolas said, this is like a group of friends. So whether it is through this initiative or other initiatives, we are always in touch. This specific initiative that created these very interesting links of cooperation between the cities, we would have to analyze how we can continue with that support and maybe include other cities that are also interested in this initiative. Elizabeth said the reports will be available in a couple of months. This was the first exercise as a general, at the general level. We will have 3 more events specific to each city, and we can continue our dialogue more specific for the city of Buenos Aires, Mexico, and Bogotá. With no further ado, I think that we will wrap up here. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add. No, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being with us, and we will wait for you in the next seminars for specific cities. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you, everyone.